many winters ago when Karen Strawn, aka Girl Writes What, pointed out that, and I believe it was in the early 20th century, a series of injuries that had occurred at the workplace to women led to changes in workplace policy regarding work safety. And this has stuck with me ever since. I refer to this as the fulcrum of gynocentrism, the point of pivoting, the thing that can actually bring about social change. And there have been other examples fairly recently of gynocentrism as a fulcrum for social change. Consider the recent changes to lifetime alimony in the swamp, aka Florida. Now, after much petitioning, Florida finally got rid of lifetime alimony. It came, ostensibly, at the behest of men and women paired up protesting the injustice of this particular policy. But rest assured that it was really women who were able to push it through. Simultaneously, at the time, there were women, feminist groups and women in general, protesting this change, insisting that lifetime alimony was in fact a necessity and a continued necessity in the future. Now, this shouldn't surprise us at all, but sometimes the idea that social change can only be brought about through gynocentrism is so blatant and so seemingly illogical and opposes notions of what the egalitarians would call, equality. It's a bit strange. So I'm going to read some passages off of an article from the Sydney Morning Herald that I discovered not too long ago. I will, of course, be posting a link. There's some detailed graphs there as well, but I want to give you a gist of what's going on here. So the female prison population is rising in Australia, and I'll read off the most pertinent bits of this to give you an idea of what's going on. More women are being locked up in Australian prisons than ever before. The incarceration rate for women is rising twice as fast as for men, surging by nearly 40% since 2005 compared to 18% for men, according to Australian Bureau of Statistics figures. In both Queensland and the Northern Territory, the imprisonment rate has risen more than 8 times faster for women than for men. Nationally, women make up 8% of the prison population. But as the numbers soar, a range of lawyers, professors, and justice advocates argue prison is the last place most female inmates should be. And here's a quote, "We should be looking at closing all female prisons, except perhaps for one," says Mirko Bajaric, a chair of Deakin University Law School in Victoria. Female over-imprisonment is a blight on our sentencing system and one of the most gratuitous human rights violations currently in Australia. Professor Bajaric believes Australia imprisons too many men and women, but on average, women should receive 75% lighter sentences for the same crimes. Equality with a vengeance, he says, has prevented judges acknowledging the distinct profile of female offenders, their lower reoffending rates, greater caregiving responsibilities, increased suffering in jail, and histories of trauma. Most women in jail could safely serve their sentences in community instead, according to the peak body for lawyers, the Law Council of Australia. UNSW criminologist Eileen Baldry has watched the rate of female incarceration in NSW, that's New South Wales, treble since starting in her field in the 1980s. Much of the increase has been concentrated among Indigenous women, who went from less than 4% of the female prison population to about 34%. Big surprise there. The rise has been extraordinary and in many ways unconscionable, Professor Baldry says. By far the majority of women inmates could be supported outside prison. And it goes on and on and on and on. Now, this is incredibly blatant. The idea, as one professor states, that despite committing identical crimes, they should be given lighter sentences. And indeed, they shouldn't be serving in prison at all. Now, we can consider the possibility and the validity of the argument that some criminals should be serving in the form of community service rather than living out prison sentences. But as far as extenuating circumstances are concerned, whatever they might be, this professor lists suffering in jail and histories of trauma. I think he's quite amiss here. The reason being simple. Each individual who ends up in prison has a particular history, a personal history, men and women. And it's not as if men don't suffer in jail. Men arguably suffer even more. The amount of violence, the gang-related violence. And maybe some of them are legitimate criminals in that sense. But the idea of meting out different punishment because of different genitalia is a bit strange, and it's so funny that for all the lamentations and protestations about egalitarianism, society doesn't really work along those lines. People like Sargon love to rant on about egalitarianism, and I'm sure he would actually take issue with this guy's statement. But the reality is that if the courts are being, quote unquote, too harsh, I mean, they're just, what is it called here? Egalitarianism or equality with a vengeance. So we need to practice exceptionalism. But if we're going to practice exceptionalism in terms of criminal sentencing, then surely that exceptionalism needs to apply to people on an individual case-by-case basis and not merely the sort of one shoe size fits all applies to women basis. That's a bit odd. But we see this continually, of course. And so when I say gynocentrism is a fulcrum for social change, what I mean by that is that really important social change almost never comes about due to general suffering or the suffering of men. And I say this in a very sober tone. I'm no longer emotionally moved one way or another by such phenomena. I'm almost indifferent. I've gotten used to it, As I've grown older and increasingly robotic, I tend not to feel very much at all. But in this particular case, this is just the way it is. But let's say the prison system could be reformed, and in this case, Australia's prison system. If there were, in fact, reform, it would come at the back end of reforms that were specifically being applied to women, and it's heavily implied, if not even directly suggested in this article. So generally speaking, this is how things work. This is how social change occurs. But there is an unusual and very interesting exception to this, and I've noted this down to myself, and I might have spoken on a few occasions in my videos, and that is when you look at the way gynocentrism doesn't seem to be operative, at least to the degree it is, in this case, when it comes to effectively crimes committed by brown-skinned Muslim men. There seems to be a kind of hierarchy of who's the greater victim. I'm thinking of various incidents, be it in Rotherham, England, the Cologne sexual assaults, which apparently it turns out many of which were covered up. There was actually an unwanted pregnancy that arose from a rape there. And so in these cases, it seems very much that being a brown-skinned Muslim male trumps being a female. And I've often thought about this. Generally speaking, in the context of Europe, Europe having been historically Western Europe, and I think to a somewhat lesser degree Eastern Europe, relatively safe compared to other areas of the world, and we're seeing increasing crime rates, how much would be enough to act as a catalyst for people to want to initiate certain policy changes and what have you? And I postulated sometimes to myself and privately in conversation to others that maybe you would need some mass incident involving women. But then again, there's a strange kind of ideology going on out there which actually prioritizes one minority figure over another alleged minority figure. In this case, brown-skinned Muslim males. I don't know where how this works in all the details, but it's clear that Islamic exceptionalism actually in this particular case trumps being female very often. I imagine if there was some similar incident, maybe dozens of young girls raped by Muslim men, probably wouldn't bring about any significant change. So I'm not really sure how this works in this sort of ideologically driven world we live in at the moment. It's a very strange scenario we find ourselves in, and one that really puzzles me. But it does go to show that sometimes ideology and political ideas can trump human nature in some sense. And I suppose people in the alt-right, of which I am not part, as I've said so many times, despite people lumping me in there, would say, well, Europeans have become less tribal, and therefore, certainly if Europe were still tribal, if it were an earlier stage, there wouldn't be a Muslim population, number one, and who knows what might happen. But it is interesting how these things happen. But generally speaking, if there is a change in divorce law, or if there's a change in prison sentencing that applies across the board, because, let's be fair, there are degrees of the preposterous that one cannot exceed in the public domain. Let's imagine, for example, that in the case of Florida, where they reformed the lifetime alimony, they said all denizens of the swamp no longer have to pay alimony, lifetime alimony, provided they are female, but men need to continue. That would be so blatantly, obviously sexist and ridiculous that no one would swallow it, and it would just be, nobody could take that. So generally speaking, these reforms can be passed, but it always comes through the back end and after it's been applied primarily for the benefit of women rather than men. But these are interesting times we're living in. In particular, this clash of the political ideological with what I would argue are more sort of natural human instincts, where women themselves rose up in opposition to people's distaste of Islam and what have you. Very strange times we're living in, indeed. But I think we reliably have to use what we have, and we have to be pragmatic. Another example of this is in my recent talks with Adam Jensen. Talk about aging research and science related to aging. What group would have the greatest interest? Well, the one group whose assets, women, are most predicated on looking youthful and young and remaining quote-unquote beautiful. Women would, of course, jump at that opportunity. They're not interested in the details or the health stuff. They're mostly interested in looking good, fine. But, you take what you can get. Cosmetic companies, as Adam Jensen pointed out, to invest a lot in aging research and what have you. So, you can't make the world into your ideal. You have to just kind of work with what you have. And I think the best way to actually pass reform, whether it comes to alimony reform or other things, is to basically let natural tendencies take over. It is interesting, though, that in Australia, the courts were actually practicing effectively egalitarian sentencing, which is unusual, but that is a mystery to be resolved for another time. More to come in the future, and as always, thanks for tuning in, and enjoy the rest of your week. And may Winston and the Overwatch gods watch over you. Bye-bye. If you liked this video, please like, share, and subscribe. And if you enjoy my content, please consider making a donation or becoming a patron. Thanks for watching.